Warm welcome to uh, warm welcome to all of you who have made time to join the second Volunteer Management Network event organized by the National Council of Social Service. We're very excited to see that we have over 100 participants joining us online today. We're expecting about 200 to 300 people who will slowly stream in later on. So this is a really strong reflection of the shared interest in how we engage our volunteers meaningfully. So my name is Janice. I'm the Assistant Director of the People Development Division at NCSS, and I'll be your MC this morning. So the Volunteer Management Network brings together leaders and volunteer managers from the people and public sectors with the purpose to share best practices that drive meaningful social impact. And today's session will uncover innovative approaches to volunteer management, and we will also explore ways to transform our volunteers into co-partners for better service user outcomes. Now, at the previous Volunteer Management Network session, about a week ago, we took a closer look at the volunteer management landscape, and we also went a little bit deeper into how the youth volunteerism landscape and insights are with Youth Corps Singapore. We also had speakers from Care Corner and the Astronauts Collective. So today, we will hear from three speakers. Ms. Nicole Pang, Head of People and Talent Development at Impart Limited. We also have Ms. Ivy Si, Chief Executive Officer at Halogen Foundation Singapore, and Ms. Lisa Gaynor, Chief Executive Officer at talenTtrust. They will share how they create meaningful volunteer opportunities in their own organization. So all three speakers will also then join us for a panel Q&A session at the end. And this will be moderated by Ms. Cindy Wong, Senior Manager of the People Development Division at NCSS. So just some housekeeping rules. For the panel session later on, you can use the Zoom Q&A function to put in your questions. You can also upvote questions, existing ones that you would like to be answered by clicking on the thumbs up symbol. Because we have limited time to answer questions, we'll first focus on the upvoted questions first. But don't worry, we will be circulating the slides after the session via the email that you have used for registration. And the speaker's contact details are also in the slides, should you wish to contact them directly for any specific questions that may not have been answered during the Q&A session. Okay, so without further ado, let me invite Ms. Nicole Pang, Head of People and Talent Development at Impart Limited. Nicole leads the organization's human capital strategy. As a co-founder of the mental health care arm, she previously scaled the team from 6 to over 100 volunteers during the COVID-19 period and co-creating many of the volunteer management processes still in use today. Nicole will share Impart's approach to volunteer management, which is grounded in meaning, purpose, and strength-based development. So Nicole, over to you, please.
Thank you, Janice. Very happy to be here today. I'm very excited to be sharing a little bit more about how we kind of, manage our volunteers and develop them here at Impart. So today, we are really excited to be sharing about how Impart is powered by people. Okay, so just a little bit more context about me, myself, as well as Impart itself. Earlier on, Janice was sharing, right, that in the thick of COVID, actually, what happened was I was graduating from university as a psychology graduate, right? And then I realized that, I just wanted to, at that point in time, all the internships were like kind of shut down and everything. And so I really just wanted to kind of like volunteer my time and to do a little bit of groundwork. That's where we started as a volunteer, right? And I started with like 5 other of my friends. We kind of did a bit of a program on the ground, and then we after that we saw great results from the program itself, just teaching children and youth coping skills. And then we just set up an Instagram. It was something very casual at first. Set up an Instagram, and then we got some of our friends do a bit of like graphic design work, and then suddenly, boom, we launched a recruitment form, and within the week, we had 100 signups, and we had no roles, we had no pathways carved out for them. And so we were like, what are we gonna do with like 100 volunteers now, right? Who all want to do good. And so it also didn't feel right for us to like reject anybody. And so what ensued from there is that we had like hundreds of conversations with each and every one of them, kind of finding out like what they wanted to do. And then that's how kind of the mental health arm was set up. And so we merged into Impart in 2021. So I served as the head of mental health care, became head of services to look over more of like quality of services, as well as the how efficient our processes were. And now I'm serving as the head of people and talent development and also dabbling a bit in corporate strategy. So, who is Impart and what do we do? We're a charity that works with children and youth facing adversities between the ages of 9 to 24 years old. When we say youth facing adversities, they are typically youths who, come from backgrounds of higher risk and higher needs. They often have a lot of adverse childhood experiences as well. And so our mission really is to give them a fighting chance through the provision of quality resources. And we do so through education, mental health care, and community. So in 2025 itself, we are very heartened that we have served more than 1,200 youths actively, and that's most of them on a weekly basis. And you can see the people who make it happen. A lot of times when we think about like, corporate structure and we think about like our manpower, we think about our full-timers, right? Like how many staff do we have? How many interns do we have? But at Impart, we really see our human capital, our volunteers as part of our human capital. And if you look at the numbers over here, our full-timers and our interns take less than 5% of the entire workforce within Impart itself. So when Impart was invited to this sharing, we were really, I was really thinking about how I could value add to this space. And I think one of the things that Impart can share a little bit more about is actually longer term volunteering. Because we don't do a lot of event-based or project-based kind of volunteering. A lot of our volunteers actually at the shortest volunteering period is about 3 months. And generally, most of our volunteers stay between 1 to 3 years, and a bunch of them are staying between like 4 to 6 years. So Impart is relatively young, lah. So the longest volunteer is about 6 years. Um, so we think about this in the form of retention as well as development. So when we think about retention, it's really about, what do I do to keep the volunteers wanting to volunteer with us beyond just that single session or just like taster, kind of sessions with us. And so it boils down to three factors. One is about meaning. And meaning and purpose is a little bit different. Purpose comes from the organization, how you craft your roles, how you kind of introduce clarity into what the scope of the role is. And it needs to be clearly communicated and understood by the volunteer. Because only then will the volunteer be able to actually draw meaning from this role itself. And that is very important because then motivations become a little bit more intrinsic, right? The second thing that we do is making sure that our roles are largely skill-based. And so a lot of times when we think about volunteer management, and especially because we are in a work setting, right? We think about this as like, hey, we have a need or a gap that's unfulfilled. How does, volunteers become a tool or a resource or a means to an end to kind of like fulfill this gap or this need? But a lot of times when we think in that way, what happens is that we forget that volunteers are also sacrificing their time and their resources and their efforts to actually be here. And, the question then becomes, what do they gain out of this experience, right? Other than feeling good from doing good. And so when we make sure that, the role is skill-based, which means that, we are contributing back to the volunteers as well. For example, if a volunteer is coming in wanting to become an educator in the future, can we link them up with our education arm and can we, teach them pedagogy skills? Can we teach them classroom management skills, for example? So upskilling them, making sure that they are also gaining something out of this, ensures that our relationship is bi-directional and is reciprocal. And the last factor that we really think is so important here is culture. So viewing and treating people as assets, not just tools and or resources. And I think that especially goes yeah, is especially important in the context of volunteers, because a lot of times they are coming in to fulfill a need or a gap that we have on the ground. And so having them feel seeing them in this light will make sure that this kind of culture permeates every single decision that we make with regards to volunteer recruitment, volunteer management, volunteer development. And so, as we now we know how to kind of like retain the volunteers a little bit longer than your single session, they very inevitably will go on to a stage, in the role where if they do it long enough, then they'll feel like, okay, I think I've learned everything in this role. It's time to find something new, or it's time to find something, that can value add to my life, differently. And so then it comes to talking about volunteer development. Big questions that we can consider over here. Strength, firstly, is thinking about things in a strength-based perspective. So instead of, only thinking, hey, I have a need. So coming from the organization, I have a need, I have a gap. How does my volunteer fulfill this? It's also about asking what strengths and values do, my volunteer bring to the team? And how can I match them appropriately such that they are serving in a capacity that is successful, serving in a capacity that's making them happy as well. Secondly, it's about life changes. So, with volunteers, especially, a lot of times, we can be tunnel vision, right? About like thinking, hey, what are the programs or what are the operations that this volunteer is involved in? But it's so important to also remember that because they are choosing to do this on top of all the other different commitments that they are having, they might be juggling work, school, personal life, friends, family, so on and so forth. It's also important to take those into consideration. And what I mean by this is that, a volunteer who's coming in, say, as an undergrad, would be really different if we are talking about, looking at a volunteer who's, say, like 34 years old. Right. As an undergrad, maybe they have more capacity to travel. Maybe they are more fluid with their timings. Maybe as a 33-year-old volunteer, they might have full-time work. So they might only be able to serve in a capacity that's like off work hours or weekends. So taking into consideration their life changes also helps us to kind of reshape the role and help them to grow together with the organization. One of the examples that we have done this is we had this volunteer who was who was a youth-facing volunteer with us. And she kind of, was serving as a ground volunteer, and then after that went on to become program manager, then program head, and then from there, she got pregnant. So she was expecting, and then she also wanted a bit of time to kind of like spend with the baby, and kind of like tone down all her other commitments, right? To be able to welcome this transition as well. And so what we did was, the moment she informed us that, she might have to have a change in her role, or like because of this different life change that she has, we would then have a conversation and kind of like map out, okay, then, at what period of time would you want to kind of explore something like differently? And so what we did in the end was at 6 months postpartum, then we kind of like reached out and see, hey, actually, do you want to be a peer supervisor, which is completely remote? So you can do it at your own time. You just literally vet through other volunteers' work and kind of like give them feedback, and guide them along. And that's exactly what she did, 6 months postpartum, and then she transitioned into a role of a peer supervisor. The third one is career goals. So this one links to because of how a lot of our opportunities are very skill based. And for example, in the mental health care department, a lot of the volunteers that come in are volunteers who have like backgrounds in psychology, in social work, and a lot of them are intending to eventually, get their license, or go on to master's program so that they can become a doctor or a psychologist or a social worker. So the question over here is, they are wanting to volunteer because they want some level of like ground experience, and they want some level of exposure so that they can continue on their career development or career pathways, right? And so the question here would be, how are we contributing to their growth? When we, speak to them, and we do this right from the very start. Actually, just in the first call that we ever have with the volunteer, we already ask, like, we're not sure if it's a big question. Where do you kind of like see yourself in the next year or so? What are you intending to pursue? And we also use this information to match them to roles that can help them in their growth. And last, but not least, is pathways. So when we talk about pathways, the question here is, have you developed sufficient and attractive opportunities? So if you remember the numbers a little bit, our full-timers actually less than 5%, right? But how and even based on like the 12 full-timers, right? Only about like 6 to 8 of them are managing volunteers. And then the rest of us are in the corporate ladder a little bit higher up, right? And so the 6 to 8 volunteers, the question is, how did they manage 327 volunteers? It's really because there are also volunteer pathways. So it doesn't end as like all the volunteers just report to staff, but our volunteer system also has a program manager, a program head, a assistant program lead. We also have peer supervisors. We also have just different of these roles that come in so that they manage different groups, different teams, and that helps us to actually expand the work. And it also allows our volunteers to actually climb up different pathways, and it's very, very dynamic for them. So one of the examples would be, our youth facing volunteer who can actually come in doing groundwork first. Then you can go into program manager. You can go into a program assistant program lead. You can go into a program head for that same program. You can also jump to a different program. So for example, you can start off by being in a very structured program of just teaching skills. You can hop into the next program where you're doing crisis work, for example. So then now it's a higher intensity, it's a different kind of work. And then you climb the ladder again of like being program manager there, being program head there. Or you could even jump to another different arm where you do, say, group level programs. So very dynamic, a lot of opportunities and a lot of pathways that are mapped out for our volunteers. Okay. Okay, and so by now, I'm not sure if some of you might think, but we invest a lot, like in our volunteers, maybe as much or as our full-timers. And this is the reason why we continue to think that it is worth it. Firstly, we have a much greater reach this way because a lot of this is especially relevant to Impart's profile as well, because a lot of the youths that we have, their backgrounds are of higher risk and higher needs, right? And so what that means is that the amount of time that we need to spend with them is a lot longer. And if I just hire a caseworker, for example, to as a solution, the max number of cases that they can take is what, 10 to 20? Between 10 to 20. And if the cases that they are working on need about, say, 1 to 2 years of journeying with them, then I mean we are unable to expand the work at all. We'll be in gridlock. And so our volunteers really enable the work. They're the heartbeat of Impart, really. And they really are the ones who make the work happen. So we have a greater reach from there. Secondly, we also have a lot of diverse skill sets. When we have such a large volunteer pool, what happens is that they actually, a lot of them, and also because of our mindset, of how we kind of also ask what kind of strengths and values these volunteers bring to the team. And so when we ask questions like that, it also allows our volunteers to share with us what kind of diverse skill sets they have and how we can match them differently as well. So we have also had a lot of like youth-facing volunteers who later on say that, hey, I need to do my thesis in the second half of the year. So I'm not sure if I can still journey directly, operationally on the ground with the youth. And so we asked, like, then you know what? Can you do content writing? Can you do material creation? Can you do social media? What are some things that you are interested in? And some people might say, like, I do TikTok for church. So I can do this, here as well. I can create reels. I can create videos. So things like that. And if anything, actually Impart's communications, right? So our social media, we've never had a full-time staff working on any of it. So all our corporate communications and everything has always been done by volunteers and interns actually. So all our social media pages. Yeah. So diverse skill sets. The third one is systemic change. So when we think about volunteers and we really want to invest in volunteers as individuals, what happens is that, the impact is so much bigger than just what your organization is doing as well. So I'll illustrate this in an example later on. But they as you develop these volunteers who come into your care, they are in the especially for Impart, they are in the social impact space, which also means that eventually or already outside of volunteering, they might be already in the social impact space as well. And so whatever you invest in them, they are going to bring back into the systems, which will help our entire community to become and our entire ecosystem to become better as well. And lastly, heart in the right place. Because when we think about volunteering, they are really doing this out of their own goodwill, right? A lot of them are coming in because they want to do good. Yes, there might be also volunteers who are coming in for very specific, intentions of, like, for example, wanting to gain ground experience with youth so they can go into a career in this industry, for example. But at the end of the day, even with these volunteers, they can just get an internship, they can just get a practicum, they can get paid for it, but they are choosing to volunteer. And I think that in itself shows us that it's important to also think about how their heart is in the right place and how we can kind of work together with them on that. And so I wanted to share a little bit more about Nourish's journey, and this really, Nourish's story really illustrates how investing in a single person can really go so far. And so I put the QR code over there. Nourish was recently featured in the Straits Times, but I won't be playing the video here because it's a bit long. So Nourish actually started out as Impart's first client. So he actually came in and he did a bit of like education work, passed his N levels with us, and then later on he became a volunteer. And as he volunteered with us, he became an intern at the mental health care arm. And then as an intern at the mental health care arm, he converted to a full-time caseworker at Impart, and the mental health care arm still. And then later on, he transferred as a full-time youth worker into our community arm and also completed his diploma at the same time. And he's first ever person in his family to complete his diploma, which is amazing, amazing work. And then from there, he is now from there, he actually met a client who told him, like, there's nothing that I want to do other than sepak takraw. So then we don't have a sepak takraw program at that point in time. Then how we were like, oh my gosh, so let's just create one. And so Nourish helmed this entire piece of work, and what he has created is a sepak takraw outreach program that is now reaching to marginalized youths, over 100 of them in this single program, who would otherwise not be interacting with any social service professional. Yeah. And so just, investing in one person and believing in them, believing in their potential, and mapping out the potential pathways for them, has a ripple effect. And you can see that, now Nourish has gone full circle, right, as a youth, and then now he's gone into being a volunteer, and then now he go into like being a full-time caseworker, and then now he's creating programs for the very youths who might be able to go into a journey like his as well. Yeah. And with that, I will be ending off with this little photo because at every year we also have an annual party that we call Imparty, a little play on the word, on the brand. And we actually just invite all our youth volunteers and our volunteers for the year, and we just come together to have fun, eat, and play. Yeah. And hopefully, this inspires you to build a little community of your own. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Nicole, for your inspiring sharing. A lot of useful insights for all of us to think about. Yeah, so without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Miss Ivy Si. She's the CEO of Halogen Foundation Singapore, a charity dedicated to transforming the lives of young people through leadership and entrepreneurship development. So Ivy first joined Halogen in a program and operations capacity, and it has since led the organization through a decade of running the Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship program in Singapore. So under her leadership, Halogen was conferred the Charity Transparency Award in 2024. In her presentation, Ivy will share how Halogen finds the perfect match between what volunteers want to do and what the organization needs, and thereby creating stronger connections that keep volunteers engaged and coming back. So over to you, please, Ivy.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having us here to do a little bit of sharing. I love that Nicole kicked us off on the Impart sharing because I feel like it's very complimentary. I kind of skinned the presentation for today to focus a little bit on the other spectrum of looking at variety because I love Nicole's story about the depth and how the volunteers journey for a long period of time. I think our retention a number of years of retention for us volunteers are on the average a bit shorter, but we try to structure the roles where we offer a broader range of things. So I would love to share a little bit more about our current practices and what's been working for us. So just a little bit of background about the organization so you know where to place us. We are, in a nutshell, a SSA that focuses on preemptive upstream work. We work with youth aged 9 to 25, and we focus on developing programs and platforms for character, mindset, and soft skills development. The belief is really that if you bring young people through building foundational attributes like a strong character, a positive and growth mindset, and entrepreneurial thinking is a part of a good mindset as well. And all the soft skills, they can thrive wherever they are. So we try to focus our work in curating all these opportunities and bring access to development to youth from underserved backgrounds. In this slide, I just wanted to, like Nicole, set context. The main purpose of showing you this slide is the first slide was our team. So we're a small outfit of about only 30 full-time staff. And you will see here that the thing that I want to draw attention to is the number of volunteers and volunteering hours that our volunteers contribute to. They're a big part of our work since inception, where we started in 2003 and our co-founders apparently started with just one staff and then a whole fleet of volunteers in running our work. Volunteers are a huge lifeline for us to get the work going. And in the subsequent slides, I'll just show a little bit of how we kind of built the scaffold and communicate some of these opportunities externally as well, because it is all of us here are practitioners. We know that getting volunteers and then like screening, directing them to meaningful pathways and engaging them, it's a lot of hard work. But for us, I think historically we've seen that it's hard work that does pay off. It's a bit tougher at the start where we get the engine going, but over time when we build the scaffolds well, the staff workload that will otherwise be devoted to front-facing all these volunteer workloads are definitely a lot more alleviated if we design it properly. First part that I wanted to curate and share a little bit, we have been very intentional in making sure that our partners can come to our website, come through our doors and know very clearly that partnering us and volunteering is a way to give back. So you'll see that one of the first few things that we did up when we formalized our volunteer department was to have a proper page. We embedded it. This schematics is actually shown to external partners. So we work a lot with our corporate partners to invite them and their staff and employees to give back as CSR. And so we want to show them that while there are all these programs that we run, partnerships and volunteering is a key vertical that we want to invite them to play a part and be involved in our work. Having this upfront is actually quite useful. Sometimes we notice over time as we get the momentum, we do have like sometimes cold calls where corporates just knock on our door and say like, hey, we read a little bit about the volunteering aspect of things. Can we find out a little bit more? And the website and the page does give us organic individual volunteers signups. It's quite a healthy pipeline when we build that structure around that. So, something like a little tip or something that you can explore if you feel that the organization is ready and want to scale up a little bit of your partners and volunteer engagements. I curated the next 3 slides just to paint a picture of how we go about scoping, because I mentioned that we have a range of different activities, but how do we actually get down to structuring some volunteer job descriptions before it goes out live to our partners, right? To invite them to play a part in it. So step one, what we originally started was really having a small fleet of team members and having a lot to do on our radar. It began with just the simple question of what are pieces of work that we could definitely want help in outsourcing. So this is a word cloud of representing the different range of things. So one thing, I guess, a little bit unique or a choice that we've made on the volunteering engagement front is we have curation for programs that will directly interface with our beneficiaries or clients, our youth, but we also have volunteer tasks that we put out there when they sign up. We actually offer like more skill-based or more back-end support as well. So the plus point is that if you are hoping to be a volunteer with the cause is meaningful to you, but you may not necessarily want to be frontlining any of our impact work, there are many options available. Back then, when we first started developing our first few prototypes of volunteer scopes and engagements, our volunteer manager or the equivalent person who had to handle the volunteer function had to go around with the internal teams to do some sort of a scoping like this, like where are tasks or work available that is currently something that we can explore scaling through external help. And this, just to highlight, I think it's actually usually mostly seen as a very straightforward, okay, do I have this job or do I have not, and then tick off and not. But I feel that in our past history of scoping projects, I would urge our volunteer managers to have a little bit of fun with it. We realize that sometimes when you look at just the job task on its surface level, it might not be something that you can really outsource. So for example, one of the roles that we have for one of our entrepreneurship programs is the business coach role. We don't have the confidence that we can outsource the whole befriending as well as coaching role entirely to a corporate volunteer whom we don't know too much about. So we meaningfully skin the role where they focus more on the technical aspect of entrepreneurship content, while we can then have lesser needs to get the full staff team out, but we have 1 or 2 chaperones who will handle the befriender aspect of things roaming around in the classroom setting. So with the net point that I'm just trying to drive is that as you explore the kind of volunteer tasks that can be scoped out for volunteers to take on, actually there is a lot of room to redesign and scope boundaries for projects or tasks that makes it easy for you to subsequently do a matching. So actually we very much see it as a design issue or challenge here. How can you scope things in meaningful components? And therefore it leads to, for example, one choice that we've made is that when we are engaging volunteers that may have less time to dedicate, like for 1 or 2 years, we are willing to take a trade-off where the task is scoped to be a bit more ad hoc, that we can do it by proper design so that the ad hoc task gets completed and it's still returned to a team who would take the rest of the components and follow through with it. It still offloads the team. So there's a lot of room to play around with how the volunteer task can be scoped. Now, after a preliminary scoping, which is very much an internal step across the different departments or partners that want to host volunteers, the volunteer team actually does have to do a brief matching with how the task might be suited or not suited to a particular demographic. So we broadly look at our volunteers in these 2 main categories with a subcategory in there because behaviorally they engage very differently. I'll just briefly touch on it. For youth volunteers, they're often looking for learning, exposure, growth is a big theme for them. So we also focus on doing engagement and development work, especially for our youth volunteers. But at the same time, actually one thing that is very parallel to what Nicole's story is that we do see our youth volunteers as also potentially put on the lens of they are like our clients and beneficiaries. Many of them may not be directly from an underserved background that we will usually encounter, but they are also young people that are on a growing journey. So the volunteer team makes it a mission also that we can leave them better off, and hopefully they will become better citizens downstream, and they'll continue their volunteering stints with other organizations. So very developmental in nature when it comes to the youth volunteer pathways. For the corporates, it's actually currently skinned into two different components. We do a lot of work as an organization to engage corporates at corporate levels. The main reason behind this is that later I'll show you a slide, but brief schematics with the 1,005 volunteers that we engage year on year. About 1,000 of them come from corporate organizations where they plant themselves into our volunteer program under the entrepreneurship program that we run for secondary school students in the NTOG1 stream. And for these organizations, the behavior, or they approach it very differently. More often than not, if you're trying to work with a corporate organization to get their volunteers to come, you speak to the CSR department or the rep, and then after that, you go through all the clearance, and then you have an opportunity to pitch to the company to say, hey, it's an open call. We're doing a lunch session around sharing about our calls. Here are some potential volunteering opportunities you can sign up for. And then it's structurally very different from individual working adults who come through the doors mainly through the website sign up. When they stumble upon it, they Google volunteering opportunities with you, and we pop up on their SEO. So the key idea for this slide is really that after you have the list of tasks, the team that stewards the volunteer engagement has to do a little bit of a mapping. Corporate volunteers tend to have very they want clearly articulated needs. So when we subsequently design our job description and briefs, it has to be sharp, to the point, very clear, upfront ideas of how much time, what's the thing that I have to do, what's the impact I'm going to make. Whereas for the youth, we find that the way they get on board in that volunteer journey tends to be more conversational. They are more interested to come by, talk to a volunteer manager, get some recommendations, ask the questions, fit this into their future pathway, some of the themes that Nicole alluded to. So they behave very differently, which is why the volunteer manager team needs to also have a sense of how the task fits the demographic or does not, so that it allows them to do proper matching. So we don't offer all volunteer opportunities to all volunteers. We try to segment according to their behavioral profile in that sense, or behavioral motivation. I was asked to kind of like paint a picture of how that process looks like. So I decided to just pull out a very simple schematics. I think then that point of trying to piece those things together. So you see that discover and define is briefly the two steps that actually is internal. It's what I earlier described, where we try to curate what are the list of tasks and opportunities available that we would love for a volunteer to take on. And then defining by allocating and figuring out which are the profiles that would take interest in tasks like these, and what kind of commitment and skills are we looking out for if we want to reach out and share this volunteer and opportunity with potential volunteers. The subsequent two parts or steps of develop and deliver is where you will start to experiment with that cycle. So back then, when we first started scaling up our volunteering, I think maybe it was like 10 years or 9 years ago. And so what we did was we picked a particular role that we felt like it would be easiest to prototype. And then we started recruiting volunteers, putting them through the cycle. It's a repeatable process, so it's a bit like an iteration, very design thinking and very methodological. The part that I think the framework really helps is that it brings alignment, because most of the time as volunteer managers, while we may focus on recruiting the volunteers, sometimes you're not able to be present in all the deployment when the volunteers show up for a volunteering engagement, right? So in a nutshell, the leadership buy-in and also the other multifunctional team department buy-in is really important. I used to remember back then, our volunteer team always like had to argue with our frontlining team. It's like, oh, I sent a volunteer down, but the volunteer was very lost, was very stressed out with what to do, why you all didn't take care of them, right? So it's about also building the alignment. The whole develop and deliver prototyping is also to make sure that from your internal team's angles, everybody has a clear idea where you hand off a volunteer after they're onboarded. Does this team host them on the ground? And then when do they return the volunteer back to the volunteer manager, and the volunteer manager can go in and say, like, how was the experience? Any feedback? And would you like to explore more opportunities? So a lot of experimenting there so that it can be then streamlined. I think an encouragement is that there's no other way other than really just doing this rapid prototyping. So I'm quite sure all of us will go through it. It's a little painful at the start, especially if we didn't have a semblance of knowing what to do and why is it important. So a lot of repeating, for example, what Nicole mentioned about culture. It's also being able to drill into the teams that it's important. We don't want to treat them as just resources. We want them to have a good time. They are also people that we want to positively impact through the work that we do. After we iterated and when we first did it, we actually chose the volunteer role and scope that had the most impact in terms of volume. Like if we nail out this job description, we'll offload the team by a lot. So back then, one of the first few roles that we prototyped was this thing called a business coach. It's under the pink box here as mentor. No, sorry, as business coach, sorry, the purple box here. And so when we started the first one, we iterated until we were very happy with it. After you get through the first one, the subsequent ones are a bit easier because then the teams on the front are a bit more familiar. What are the things to look out for? So this schematic is just a semblance of each box here represents a job description or a project role that we have formalized, like we can show you a job description on. There is a proper process where we know where do we hand off the program to the other team and all. Sorry, it's not me, right? The screen is black on my end. But anyway, and then we have started to park it back into a certain flow. So you'll see some diagrams and arrows in the schematics. No worries, they will share the slides later so you can revisit that. But that was our attempt to actually tackle the question of retention, because some volunteers will come in and ask other questions like, okay, after I've done this for a while, is there any other option that I can opt for? I want to try something different. And so that all these boxes and the arrows in that schematics basically just show how we are also thinking about the different roles and pathways of our volunteers. This is the back-end schematic. So we don't load this to our corporate volunteers or our youth volunteers. The little yellow box at the side is important. I think the part that I just wanted to highlight is that it is infrastructure intensive. After we started formalizing more roles, we need to make sure that we have the proper back-end SOPs, right? So supporting workflows are extremely essential, because while you can craft a great JD job description for volunteers, you can find the best people, but we are all part of the interface with the volunteer experience and their user journey in that sense. So these are some of the things that we've built into our workflow over time. Like, how do we have that list of job descriptions? The corporates love it. They will always ask for a job description, just like how you will list for a full-time hire. So we have a stack of like our job descriptions for all these roles. We have them handy. And then over time, we had to build a more intentional and clearer, and now we've started to make it digital because there's volume of volunteers, so we couldn't afford to onboard everybody in an in-person call anymore. So there's now an online onboarding process that we're trying to port over so that we can handle the volume without straining the volunteer staff. Checking in feedback, so there are mechanisms that we don't check in with the volunteer every time they go down for a session. That will be too much too, but there is a way where we would look at the volunteering hours back end and try to do a regular review, especially for the different roles that they have. So the youth volunteers are most closely monitored because we also see it as a developmental program for the youths that come through our doors and volunteer. Last but not least, this one really important, all your safeguards, right? So while the volunteers might be already asking and you might already have them sign a child protection policy and acknowledgements of these things, or when we're on the ground. So most of our volunteers don't interact with the youth unmonitored. So there will always be a staff around. But then that's it. When things happen, how do we actually escalate the issue? So for example, if a corporate volunteer says something that is inappropriate and the staff found out about it, how do we bring it back to the volunteer manager and then allow the volunteer manager to actually share it with the corporate volunteer rep as feedback. Yeah. Our last slide, and I'll just keep everything else for the Q&A. It's just to summarize some key learnings. I also chose a photo with all our volunteers. So this was a new initiative that we did last year. We invited all our volunteers to do a community walk with us. We are based in a very convenient space, Chinatown. So we actually did a heritage but interactive youth development issue-based like demo activities, and then we engage them in the community walk. One thing that we're trying to pilot this year is to invite a selected group of volunteers who have been with us for quite some time, and we're gonna invite them to become ambassadors of ours, and we hope to structure a way where they can then be our like schools, trainers for our other incoming volunteers. So they will help us with engaging and also developing development content that can help our volunteers grow. But it's by the volunteers for the volunteers. So that's something that we're experimenting on this year. With that, I guess I'll leave the rest to Q&A. Feel free to ask any questions that you would like me to elaborate more about. Yes.
Thank you so much, Ivy, for such an informative sharing. Yeah, I'm sure our participants here have all gained many great takeaways from your presentation. Moving on, let me now invite Ms. Lisa Gaynor, Chief Executive Officer of talenTtrust. So since 2016, Lisa and her team have connected hundreds of corporate leaders with Singapore nonprofits to share their knowledge and skills, enabling nonprofits to access talent to enhance their internal capabilities, upskill and to scale. And under Lisa's leadership, talenTtrust was recently conferred the President's Volunteerism and Philanthropy Award 2023 for Organisation of Good Nonprofit category. So Lisa will share how talenTtrust partners skilled volunteers to co-create and develop meaningful programs and services for SSAs. So Lisa, please.
Thank you, Janice. Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be with you all here today and really try to bring to life for you how we partner with skilled volunteers to co-create programs and services. Like many of you, talenTtrust is an IPC registered charity. So we are essentially a charity that serves other charities. You can see here our vision: create a nation of active, skilled volunteers. That's what we want to do, to share their talent and uplift and deepen the impact of nonprofits. And our mission is very straightforward, and that's to strengthen nonprofits and their impact through skills-based volunteering. So a little bit about our programs. Both Ivy and Impart, not necessarily Nicole, but Naresh from Impart, have participated in our accelerator programs. So that really is our flagship skills-based volunteering program. It's 6 months in duration, and what we do there is we pair a nonprofit with a very specific organizational challenge that could range anything from comms to strategy, digitalization, HR, for example. And we go out and we build a team of 4 to 5 skilled volunteers who are going to journey with that nonprofit over 6 months. Then the learning series is really more lighter touch in nature. It's a quarterly series, 2 to 3 hours, and I'm sure many of the folks on the call today have joined some of those series. Example of one might be with Bloomberg that we did last year around how do you use data to tell stories better visually. And finally, our Next Gen leadership program, that is our newest program. And it's actually the first time that talenTtrust has ever tapped on volunteers ourselves. We are wonderful at providing volunteers for other SSAs, but we've never done it for ourselves and actually harnessed our own volunteers to help us create a program. So the Next Gen program is a program that was designed to provide first-time managers in the nonprofit sector with essential training and mentoring to step up into a management role. And that's going to be the subject of the first case study. So I thought it might be helpful to share with you folks 2 case studies on how we actually did this and how we wrangled skilled volunteers to provide their insights and help shape and design programs. So this is really an example of a truly volunteer-led design program. And a key feature to the success of this was developing that advisory committee, but importantly, behind the scenes internally, was the collaboration that went on within our team. So it's not just the volunteer manager saying, okay, you go out and find the volunteers. It's not the head of programs, you go design this. It's the team coming together and all sides working together and collaborating to build that advisory committee and to keep that moving on in the design phase. So what does that look like in reality? In reality, that looks like our volunteer manager making recommendations to our head of programs around some volunteers along the lines of what Ivy said. You know, you want for key roles that are crucial, you want to ensure that you're recommending volunteers that you might have worked with before, or you know their working style and you know that they can deliver, if you will. So our volunteer manager was almost like hand picking and saying, I think this person has the right skills. They come from an L&D background, or they run an early career program in their organization. So she curated a list of potential volunteers. She passed those over to our head of programs. And then our head of programs just had a lot of coffees and a lot of conversations, just sharing the vision of what this program is, you know, to see, is there buy-in? Are they aligned? Can they commit? Do they really want to get stuck in and roll their sleeves up to help do this? So once our head of programs had decided on who she wanted to be on that advisory committee, we all got together and got to work. So the ideation, that took a fair bit of time. And we were just having really frank conversations with the volunteers. And the volunteers we had to provide context were folks from the corporate sector who were running early career programs for first-time managers, those pathways for the early career joiners in corporates. It was head of L&D, it were coaches, you know, trainers. That's sort of the caliber of folks that we had. So we were asking them questions around things like the design of the program, the format of the program, what's best practice in their experience for early careers. We wanted to really tap their insights as well to help us with the research phase. And I think the research phase was really critical for us because it's fine to garner the insights from corporate volunteers, but this is a program for nonprofit leaders. And we really needed to ensure that the content in the program was for nonprofit leaders, and the context is very different operating environments, very different resources, budgets that you can put to this. So we really wanted to make sure that we were gathering the insights from first-time managers, from charity CEOs, through surveys, through roundtables. So they were looking at our questions that we developed. They were looking at our interview guides, even things as small as that, advising on the interview guides, the learning modalities, what the program structure could be. So that was sort of the ideation phase. And once we had, conducted, sorry, I'm jumping, you're getting all my oopses. Once we had completed the research, then we actually got stuck into the planning phase. And as far as the duration of this, how long this took us, we started in March of 2025. So the recruitment started January 2025. We had our advisory committee meeting in March of 2025. We had, again, as Ivy said, those corporate volunteers, they want to know what they're signing up for. You know, we had terms of reference for them. We had JDs. They knew exactly why they were there and in what capacity and what their role was to provide insights and guidance. And we met every 2 months. So every 8 weeks, we came back together, we regrouped. And then when it got a bit closer to the kickoff, which was November last year, it might have been the head of programs having some one-off calls with people, but on average, it was around January to November of bi-monthly meetings. So when we got into the planning, that was really going deep, taking those research findings and then validating those findings. So we were asking questions around like taking the top, for example, content topics and aligning on which topics might be more appropriate. Some folks wanted to focus on technical skills, like how do I forecast a budget? If I'm managing for the first time, I now have a budget. Well, that wasn't the focus of this program. It was really building up those management muscles. So helping us curate the content and the topics, the learning modalities, you know, building in peer learning. Will it be panels? Will it be workshops? Aligning all of that. The proposed mentorship model as well. We had a proposed model and we got some really good advice from the volunteers not to go with that model. And our initial idea was, because talenTtrust has access to so many incredible volunteers, could we pair a participant with multiple mentors so they could tap on different perspectives as they journeyed through this program? And our advisory committee advised against that, particularly the folks who have that learning and the development background, because as the managers are developing and building up those muscles, again, it would be great if they could have a longer term relationship with one mentor where they could actually share and be vulnerable about, hey, I went back to work and I tried to have a difficult feedback conversation. It didn't go well. How could I do it better next time? So we really took that on board, and it was very useful for us to structure, plan. Things like marketing materials, marketing collaterals, how do we go out to market? Things like pricing down the road. This is a free program to nonprofits this year, but the idea is we will be charging fees. What do fees look like? What could the pricing model look like? One of our volunteers is absolutely amazing as well, and she went out and secured an assessment tool, GENOS assessment tool, and actually paid for that. Which was above and beyond what we ever expected. And we could incorporate that in, and then the participants were able to benefit from that. And we are weaving that assessment throughout the curriculum now. It sounds like a lot, I know, but when you do have those structured asks and those intentional meetings carved out throughout the year, everyone knows exactly why they're coming together. And it's very, very productive, and the momentum just continues. It's quite incredible how it comes to fruition. And now we are actually in implementation phase. The program's live, it's running, and we were looking, how do we incorporate our volunteers into the execution and the delivery? So again, our volunteer manager was exploring what volunteers could be featured as speakers on panels. She was also spending a lot of time really identifying who would be a strong mentor for that one-on-one mentoring. Because as I said, each participant would be journeying with someone for 6 months, and we really wanted trusted sounding boards and folks that we knew, that we trusted, and that knew talenTtrust. But importantly, for the mentors, we actually reached out to volunteers who had participated in those accelerator programs at another point for either up to 6 months to a year. So they really understood some of the challenges of the nonprofit sector and the operating environment and the constraints. We're also going to be tapping on our volunteers for the evaluation. We are inviting our advisory committee. They're coming to our programs, they're coming to those sessions, and they're giving feedback as well, so we can incorporate that into the next. And this I thought might be there. Here's another whoops from me. This I thought might be really nice for the SSAs on the call, because this is actually a case study where we partnered with an SSA through our accelerator program, where we tapped on our team of volunteers to help them co-create a new program. So in this instance, the organization was Oh Joy, wonderful nonprofit that provides services to isolated seniors. And they came to us because they wanted to develop a go-to-market plan. And they wanted to focus on a new social enterprise that they were developing. And they wanted to tap on the insights of our volunteers, and importantly, really test the concept and validate if this was a viable concept. So what we did is we formed an amazing group of volunteers who you can see in the photo with our program manager. And one of the individuals headed up a market research company, which was absolutely brilliant. And he actually went back to his company and he recruited other volunteers, because a big part of this project was doing the market research, conducting focus groups with OJOY's active senior volunteers to really understand their motivations, what were some of the barriers to being an elder sitter. And he went back to his company and said, hey, who else wants to get involved in this? This is an amazing way that you can use your market research skills in a really purposeful and different and unique way. And luckily for us, he was able to draw in more volunteers. And what that meant for OJOY is they were able to conduct focus groups in languages other than English, which was phenomenal, particularly for the seniors. And those insights actually supported OJOY. It brought really, really interesting insights and data around the elder sitter experience. What's it really like for them? What do they like about being an elder sitter with OJOY? What don't they like? How could it be improved? Who would want to go on to be a companion through the Jolly Companion service? Why not? And another area that the volunteers provided expertise was around the pricing model for OJOY. If they're going to market, how are they going to price this service? So finally, here's a page with a lot of tips, and I'm just going to focus on a few. This is my last slide. So I know a lot of folks, so how do you find the volunteers? You know, those skilled volunteers, they exist. So speak to your board members, speak to your CEO, speak to your head of partnerships, your fundraising manager, the folks that are already having those conversations with your corporate partners. Look at your LinkedIn followers, you know, who's following you, reach out to them. But importantly, once you find them, make the ask. Make the ask. I will say it 3 times, make the ask, because in my experience, there's a deep reluctance to ask volunteers or skilled corporate volunteers to help. And we hear things all the time like, no, they're too busy. They've got a big travel schedule. You know, they're rarely in Singapore. They're an APAC role. We can't ask them, or all these assumptions that people will not say yes. But in our experience, people want to help. They are humbled, deeply humbled when you ask them to contribute and when they are perceived as someone who can offer value to your work. So please, please, please make the ask. And the other area, again, links back to my earlier slide, is the need to collaborate internally. Get a working group. Doesn't have to be, an advisory committee. Get a working group together. Integrate across your team. Bring in your leaders, bring in your head of partnerships, bring in whomever you need to bring in, but it's not just on the volunteer manager's shoulders. It's a whole organization-wide effort when you're getting a new program off the ground, and collaborate. And I think what's really important is the second last point as well, I'll end on that, is volunteers are there to provide subject matter expertise, but don't feel compelled to take all their advice. You have the context, your organization, your beneficiaries. It's about co-creation, it's about collaboration, not them prescribing to you what needs to be done. It's you tapping their insights, go, yeah, that's great, that'll work, or wonderful idea, we might park that, it might not be so relevant, but you are ultimately in the driver's seat, so feel like you can say yes or no, because you can. And on that note, I will end, and feel free to pop any questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for the generous sharing on how talenTtrust can support our participants here today with their volunteer management needs, and also encouraging all of us to take the first step, right, to just make the ask to our volunteers. So now that we have heard from all three speakers, we'll now re-invite them to join us for the panel Q&A session. Ms. Cindy Wong, our Senior Manager from NCSS, will join them as the moderator. So just a reminder that due to a limited time, we will address questions with the most upvotes. And also you can approach the speakers, the very friendly speakers here who have provided their direct email contact for you to reach out specifically on any questions that you may have and that they may not have the time to answer in the Q&A box. Yeah, so over to you, Cindy.
Thank you, Janice. Can you all hear me well? Good?
Yes,
Okay.
all good.
Okay, thank you for all the questions that we have received. We have answered quite a few in the meantime while the speakers are actually presenting. So take a look at the answered questions as well. Just for the open questions, we have one that is pretty much upvoted, and it's talking about diversity in volunteering opportunities, and talking about how complex it is for the BM team to frame the structure, to pivot here and there, who could be in charge of what, and also getting like a VM system up and running to organize all this diversity in terms of the volunteers. And this person is wondering whether it's been a hurdle to the speakers here. And I think the answer is definitely yes. But please elaborate, speakers. We start with Ivy.
Sure. Yeah, so in a nutshell, it's definitely yes. I would perhaps frame it first as first of all, it's good to have leadership buy-in. So if you feel like as a VM or someone stewarding the VM strategy, there is a need to actually have good conversations with the different teams to align expectations. For our end, we provide certain safeguards. For example, everyone can speak to a potential volunteer, but if you want to convert one because someone's interested to sign up, they have to actually fill out a volunteer form. So they can't just like, you bring a friend because your friend wants to volunteer and they just show up for the session. So that's like giving boundaries, right? So the teams will always refer the people who are interested. They can speak to them as and when they meet taxi driver, go for a networking event, but all the signups go directly to the volunteer manager team. And it's basically like a Google form where it comes up. And then back end to ease the system, because usually the volunteer manager will actually meet every single one of them, even online or on site, just to do a little bit of screening. If the volunteer is someone that is a referral or you have already encountered and worked with them, they can give a back-end recommendation to say like, oh, I've met the person's okay, and we would like to actually invite the person to be a speaker for the following event. So the main thing that is complex is just probably the initial stage where there's a lot of like, people ask, so whose responsibility is this? right? After the volunteer gets okay, and the volunteer manager says, oh, there is a upcoming engagement that we'd like to involve you in. The moment the volunteer says yes for us, we would then pass it to the program or the frontlining team to follow through with it. So the boundaries that we set for the volunteer manager team is to focus on the curation, doing all the guidebooks, the paperwork, and also screening, and running the 101 with what is the Halogen way, what do we do, and what are the volunteering opportunities available. The moment they give or allocate, so-called allocate a volunteer project to the volunteer, the host department will have to handle it. So for example, if I need a volunteer to just help me with back-end admin work, I am tasked to be hosting the volunteer once the volunteer team gives me the volunteer, secures me the volunteer. So I think at the start, it's just a lot of clarification to make sure that people know where to go. And our choice is that we split it according to this way. So there are some boundaries because our volunteer manager, and someone asked the question, how big is the team, right? So we only have like 2 or 3 head counts to handle the volume of it. So our choice, so it's more like a choice, is that upon securing or matching, the host department handles the actual volunteering stint and then returns the volunteer back to the volunteering team for the next matching. Yeah. So that's for us.
Wonderful. Thank you. Nicole, is that the same over at Impact?
A little bit different. So Impart's volunteer management is quite high touch point just because we actually so all of them go through a screening interview, which is 2 stages. So one as a general screening, and then the second round with like almost like an employee interview. But we choose to do it this way because we are working with youth profiles who are of higher risk, higher needs. And what I mean by that is also that like a lot of times we are working with, case types or like symptoms like suicide, self-harm, abuse. And so we need to be really, really careful with who we are letting in on the ground as well. And so because of this kind of like interview structure, and they also go through and quite an intense like training. So it's actually 3 days in person for youth facing. And if they are non-youth facing, it's actually 1 day in person, which means that we see every single one of our volunteers. So we have sight on them. And because of that, it's easy for our volunteer manager to kind of like, easier lah for our volunteer manager to kind of, assign and to work through any of like the back-end administrative tasks that are needed. And on the ground, I think a little bit more similar to IB, where the program or like the the program or the arm itself manages the volunteers during their time with us. Yeah. So if they are, for example, moving from like a youth-facing volunteer in mental health care into program manager, into peer supervisor, so on and so forth, as long as they're within the mental health care arm, the head of mental health care deals with that. It's only if they want to like kind of switch over, or they want to kind of off board, or they want to pause their volunteering, then they come back into like the volunteer manager's care.
Thank you, Nicole. Lisa, how about how you deal with the skilled volunteers that you have in talenTtrust?
Sure. We are high touch as well, low touch with volunteers that have volunteered with us before. But the high touch is our volunteer manager will meet with every individual who would like to volunteer with us. And it's for a few reasons. One, to understand their motivation. Why do they want to do this? And to Nicole's point earlier, to understand their why, to understand the meaning that they are that they're striving for through this volunteer opportunity, and us to convey the meaning of our work and the importance of the work. And also beyond the skills, obviously that's critical part of the meeting, is to really understand their background, their skills, functional skills, soft skills. But it's also to get an idea of who the person is and the personality type, because volunteering in a team of volunteers is very different than volunteering one-on-one. So we're dealing with really senior business volunteers, most of whom are used to directing work a lot, right? And telling people what to do. So to bring 4 to 5 of those individuals together takes a lot of induction. And you want to get a sense of their personality. Are they domineering? We ask them, what's your role? How do you function in a team? What role do you like to play in a team? Because we don't want to have scenarios where you've got a volunteer in front of a nonprofit for the first time saying, you really should be doing this, So it's a lot of careful screening, so we can match them to the causes that they care about as well. So the volunteer manager does all that. Then they are handed over to the programs team. They are matched to a particular nonprofit project that we have. The volunteer manager will sit in on a few of the meetings, so we get a sense of who they are and what they're like when they're in a meeting as well, and whether they would be a good speaker down the road, whether they'd be a good mentor down the road. And then at the end, it's passed off to the volunteer manager as well. And this last year, we intentionally developed a newer program for volunteers to create community amongst the volunteers. Because when you're on a talenTtrust project, you are seeing the same volunteers month on month, those 4 to 5 people around the table, but there is an incredible network of hundreds of volunteers. So we've created something called talenTtrust Connect, where they can come together and meet each other as well.
Nice. So it's also about creating that community within the volunteers, right? Okay, I will now move on to something that came up during registration. Quite a number of people actually asked questions around this area. Because ladies, you were talking about, like hand holding the volunteers at the start and then giving it to maybe program folks and then passing them back and forth between the volunteer manager and program folks, right? Some SSAs may have pretty good relationships between the two teams, like you all, but some may not have that. So there was this question about how do you get buy-in, when that kind of collaboration isn't quite as smooth as it should be. What are the things that you have done to overcome this challenge? Let's start with Nicole this time.
Yeah, Cindy, what do you mean by buy-in from who?
I guess it's more like some SSAs may not have like the culture that you're talking about. So the program folks and the volunteer folks, they don't really think of volunteers as human capital. So how do you overcome that challenge?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a tough question to answer. I think a lot of times, especially I mean, with Impart, we do crisis work, right? We do a lot of crisis work. And so in most part of our works, we actually try not to respond to them as crisis. So a lot of the things that we are doing are putting in structures in place so that we are doing more preventative kind of like adopting a more preventative approach. So if we are at a stage where your programs and your volunteer management team isn't speaking, then I think we need to go back to the drawing board and kind of think about hey, what structures can we put in place, what kind of conversations do we need to have, what kind of fit even down to hiring and recruitment do we need to consider so that we can create kind of culture that we want. And I think this also then boils down, the reason why you need to go back to the drawing board is because you also need to have a vision or a sense of how you want this culture to look like. Because, we are sharing, all three of us are sharing about our team cultures, but that may not be what works best for your organization and the industry that you might be in as well. And so going back all the way to the drawing board, figuring out first what kind of culture, what kind of like interactions are you looking to have? And then moving on to, everything down the road, like hiring, recruitment, what factors do we need to look at? What criteria do we need to look at? What kind of conversations we need to have? And then slowly making those changes. And I think ultimately, because, it's going back to the drawing board and it's going back to strategy, actually, then I think both Ivy and Lisa has mentioned about getting buy-in from higher management, and getting buy-in from like top down. They need to have like the same mindset as like whatever the ground staff want to kind of like conduct as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Lisa or Ivy, anything else to add to this question?
Yeah, I'll just chime in to add on to what Nicole has mentioned, because I would say the leadership role here is quite important. Nicole contextualized it to talk about leadership and also vision. I saw the other questions. There were some questions that I feel like there's a symptomatically, right? One, you don't have buy-in where the teams feel like this is more work for me. In other words, like when they have to handle the volunteer, there's more to jaga on the ground, so there's a lot of resistance. Or it could be an unspoken fear of, you're getting a volunteer to do all my work, so am I going to be obsolete after that? Which I go back to again, vision or leadership, because I feel like it is more unspoken. For an organization that is doing introducing volunteers into their whole ecosystem, it's also part and parcel of change management. And behavior change is always takes time and takes a lot of conversations and facilitation. But I would urge or suggest that if the goal of the organization and the clarity in that vision is that the fleet of volunteers that are onboarded are to really help alleviate certain kinds of roles that the staff are doing, and then from there you can actually achieve more because your staff are doing the work that will add more leverage to the mission. So at the end of the day, the beneficiaries benefit. So I think all these conversations cannot be unspoken. It has to be talked about openly, such that people catch on the vision of, yeah, we're really leveraging on the fact that there are external resources and external knowledge and expertise, but this will help us as SSAs do better work for the people that we're trying to serve. Then once you get that explicitly out of the way, everything is just the how and the technicalities, which is usually easier to tackle after um the buy-in. So I see that as more as a psychological buy-in, like let's leave these questions not unanswered and people are guessing what's going to happen to me after that. So it's, in our case, we actually tell the volunteer managers, right? Like we actually need you to be doing all these other work, like analysis, thinking of new modalities, creating new roles. I don't want you to be in the weeds of just the execution of day to day. This is why we need you to actually structure your task so that you can so-called work up the value chain. Not that volunteers are not valuable, just that I think you'll get what I mean. Because we are focusing on our specialty, so we need to actually free up the space to actually do other parts of synthesis or deep work. And volunteers can really play a really good part in helping us make our lives easier. Now join me in making sure that the design is something that is smooth for you as well. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I believe that's the same with Lisa. And I think we have really fabulous CEs here. So if SSAs, if you need to convince your senior management, maybe get them to have a coffee with Ivy or Lisa. Let me move on to our last question. There's a couple of questions here, and also it came out during registration. This blurring of the line between staff and volunteer. I think, Ivy, you touched on it a little bit already just now in your answer. It's more like this blurring of line, how you manage that. Because, like staff, you mentioned like staff would feel maybe like, oh, yeah, are you taking away my job? Or when does a volunteer become your staff? Or, that transition from volunteer to staff. So maybe we get Nicole to start off, and then we can get Lisa to add on that. And then Ivy? Okay. Nicole, please.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question because it's really about scoping actually. And yeah, it's really about scoping and also understanding the differences between the commitment level of like the volunteers as well as the staff, right? Staff is here full time, right? They are 5 days a week. They are dedicated. Their time is dedicated to working through a lot of these tasks. Volunteers, right? Even if they are, say, doing a lot of things, right? What is the role that's given to them, and like how many hours does that like kind of map to? And I think when it comes to a point, if you come to a point where, they are actually going to be here like 5 days a week, something like that, a little bit intense. But if that really happens, then I think maybe if you have the budget, maybe it's a good consideration, right? Like if this person is aligned, they're doing work like 5 days a week already, you hire them. Yeah. So I think we don't really I don't think the jump is so huge on Impart, and I don't think we've seen like volunteers like do 5 days a week kind of like work with us. We do have volunteers who like show a lot of potential, and then they are very dedicated in terms of like going above and beyond. Sometimes they are open to responding to crisis together with us, in the middle of the night, things like that. And when that happens, and we have capacity opening up, we actually ask them if they want to be an intern or like if they want to come on as a full-time staff. Actually, I would say about 70% of the Impart staff team all started out as volunteers with us, and then we converted them. We don't really we don't really do as much like open external hires. Yeah.
Thank you, Nicole. Lisa, anything to add to that?
We're different, than Halogen and Impart in that we don't use volunteers they're the lifeblood of our organization. They are the ones delivering in the program meetings, but they're not the program managers. I think what Nicole said is spot on. It comes down to the scoping of the role. It comes down to, in the corporates, they've got the know your client, the KYC. It's like the KYV, know your volunteer. Know why they want to volunteer with you. Are they interested in working with you ultimately? We hear some people say, for example, they are, they might be mid-40s, they've been in the corporate world, and they're starting to now intentionally design their exit from corporate, and they want to enter nonprofit. So can they start volunteering with us and get a sense of what that world is like? But we haven't really had anyone who, we've had people who have joined us as staff after, but we haven't had that blurring. I think where there's sometimes a bit of blurring might be more the committee members, like our comms committee, fundraising committee. They can blur all they want and go out and raise as much funds as they want. But someone may be getting a bit too hands-on, and I think as program managers, we're very used to having conversations with our volunteers when they might be overstepping, perhaps, with the volunteers. Or with the nonprofit. So just open conversations, scoping out, so everyone knows everyone's intentions and motivations is all I would add.
Ivy? Last word from you?
I wondered whether the question I kind of interpreted it because there were two questions around the staff bit.
Yes.
So
staff bit,
when both Nicole and Lisa were responding, I actually thought of more in the case where there's a very enthusiastic volunteer who spend a lot of time with you, and then maybe they have also some corporate experience, and so every now and then there are use cases where the volunteer is so enthusiastic they just jump straight in and they give recommendations to the team. Oh, you should do this, you should do this. So I interpret it as the other way as well in terms of, I guess, the blurring of the lines. But I think usually that does happen, to be frank, and more often than not with corporate volunteers, because they have a wealth of experience running their own organizations, leading teams, right? To Lisa's analogy, like you're bringing a fleet of very established people who have their own track record, and when they are very enthusiastic to contribute, they will also have maybe a lot of comments to also give. I think that one, there's no running from in the VM role. You just have to learn how to manage some of these. Not every response that the volunteer provides needs to be taken and absorbed and integrated. but the team that is front facing with these really enthusiastic volunteers, but also when there's a little bit of scope creep, I guess it does rarely. I've not really had to intervene, but in cases where they're really enthusiastic, then someone might have to step in to kind of do re-establishing some boundaries. From the staff level, actually, in all our programs, we know like the buck stops with the staff. Like if something unpleasant or not good happens at a session, it's never like, oh, because my volunteer did it. It's always the staff. So I feel like in terms of ownership and in terms of knowing that the accountability is with the staffers, that can be established such that the staff know and understand that their job is to figure out how to manage, but not like succumb to like what might be a dominant voice, because the accountability is with the staff and the SFA at the end of the day. And most volunteers are quite reasonable when you explain to them the context of it. So that's a different interpretation to the staff and the role scope creep question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ivy. So thank you so much. We don't have time to answer all the questions, but thank you, speakers, for all your perspective. I will hand the proceedings back to Janice.
Yeah. So thank you once again to all three of our speakers, Nicole, Ivy, and Lisa, for the engaging Q&A session. So a big thank you to everyone who has joined us today to learn from our speakers. We are really excited to see how you will start using the insights to unlock the full potential of your volunteer initiatives. So before we end this session, please let us know what else you'd like to see in our future volunteer management network sessions. So your feedback is very important to us. And finally, we will be holding one last volunteer management network session next Thursday, 12 February. So if you've not signed up yet, you can use the QR code to do so. And our confirmation email will be sent out to you 1 week before the session. Okay, so we will pause here for you to scan the QR codes. And thank you once again for joining us. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your week.